The Korean Mafia boss was inspecting his territory when a trembling hand grabbed the lapel of his expensive suit. Not an assassin, not a rival enforcer, but a terrified delivery girl. He looked down. She was soaked to the bone, clutching a thermal bag like a shield, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. She leaned in, ignoring the danger of touching a man like him. "Please," she whispered into his neck tattoos. "He's following me." His bodyguard stepped forward instantly. No one touched the boss, but Jang raised a hand, stopping them. He didn't push her away. Instead, he did something that froze the entire street. He wrapped a heavy, protective arm around her shoulder and pulled her tight against his side. "Who?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. She didn't speak. She just looked toward the darkness. That's when he saw him. A hooded figure standing motionless in the rain, staring back. The boss tightened his grip on the girl, not because he was kind, but because in his city, predators didn't hunt without his permission. "Stay with me until the end, because this single act of protection was about to start a gang war that would burn the city to the ground." Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The air in the private VIP room of the Club Nexus was conditioned to a sterile, expensive chill, but Mr. Choi was sweating through his collar. Jang Dong-soo sat at the head of the mahogany table, absolute stillness in a room full of nervous energy. He wore a suit that cost more than the average citizen earned in a decade, midnight black Italian silk, tailored to razor-sharp perfection. It was designed to civilize him, to make him look like a CEO of a venture capital firm, but it couldn't hide the truth rising from his collar. Dark, geometric tribal ink crawled up the side of his neck, disappearing into his slick-back hairline. In the Seoul underworld, those tattoos weren't just decoration. They were a warning label. They signaled that Jang hadn't bought his seat at the table. He had carved it out with a blade. "It is a simple logistics issue, boss," Choi stammered, his eyes darting to the two guards by the door. "The port authority changed the inspection schedule. The container is just stuck." Jang didn't blink. He picked up a heavy crystal tumbler of whiskey, the ice clinking softly in the silence. "Stuck," he repeated. His voice was a low baritone, smooth but vibrating with a subterranean threat. "My assets are not static, Mr. Choi. They flow. When they stop, it is not an accident. It is incompetence." "I can fix it," Choi insisted, his hands shaking as he reached for his water glass. "Give me 2 days." Jang stood up. The movement was fluid, effortless. He walked around the table, the leather soles of his shoes silent on the plush carpet. He placed a hand on the back of Choi's chair. The older man froze, the smell of expensive cologne and cold rain wafting off the boss. 2 days is a lifetime," Jang whispered. Without a shift in his breathing, Jang grabbed the back of Choi's head and slammed his face into the mahogany table. The sound was a wet, sickening crunch. Choi howled, blood instantly spraying across the polished wood and onto the sleeve of Jang's pristine white shirt. Jang didn't recoil. He simply leaned down, bringing his face inches from the sobbing man. The tendons in his neck flared, stretching the black ink into a terrifying, distorted shape. "You have 6 hours, Jang said, his voice devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "If the container is not moving by midnight, you will be in it." He straightened up, adjusted his cuffs, and glanced at the spot of blood on his wrist with mild annoyance. He tossed a silk handkerchief onto the table next to the ruined man. "Clean this up." Jang turned and walked out of the room, leaving the brutality behind him as if he were merely leaving a boring meeting. He checked his watch. The night was young, and the rain outside was calling. The wolf had left his den, and he was hunting for order in a chaotic city. The rain in this part of the city didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. Jimella shifted the strap of the thermal delivery bag, the nylon digging into a bruise on her shoulder that hadn't had time to heal. It was the 12th hour of a double shift, and her legs felt like lead pipes, heavy and aching with every step against the wet pavement. The neon sign of a 24-hour pharmacy buzzed overhead, flickering pink light across the puddles. She checked her phone, battery at 12%, one more drop-off 3 blocks away. Just get the food to the customer, get the tip, get home. That was the mantra. She turned onto 4th Street, the wind whipping the oversized delivery jacket around her thin frame. It was quiet here, the kind of heavy, industrial silence that amplified the sound of her own breathing. Then she heard it. Splash, splash. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and too close. Jimella didn't look back immediately. Growing up in this neighborhood taught you that looking back was an invitation. She adjusted her grip on the bag, her knuckles white, and quickened her pace. The footsteps behind her matched her rhythm instantly, a syncopated echo that made the hair on her arms stand up beneath the layers of cheap polyester. She walked past a darkened electronics store, using the glass display window as a mirror. Her reflection was a blur of dark skin and exhaustion, but behind it, a shadow moved. A figure in a dark, shapeless hoodie, head bowed against the rain, maintaining a perfect, predatory distance of 10 yards. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Maybe he's just walking, she told herself. Maybe he lives around here. She took a sharp right at the next corner, a senseless detour that took her away from her destination. She held her breath, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Splash, splash. He had turned too. The dread wasn't a sudden shock. It was a cold, creeping liquid that filled her stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a hunt. The exhaustion that had been dragging her down moments ago evaporated, replaced by a sharp, chemical spike of adrenaline. The street ahead stretched out like a dark tunnel, the streetlights suffering from broken bulbs, leaving pools of ink-black shadow between the safety of the light. She gripped the thermal bag tighter. It was full of lukewarm noodles, absurdly useless as a weapon. She was alone, the battery on her phone was dying, and the footsteps behind her were getting faster. She didn't need to look back to know he was closing the gap. The hunter had sensed the prey was panicking, and he was picking up speed. Jimella scrambled around the corner of the brick textile factory, her boots sliding dangerously on the wet asphalt. She needed lights, she needed a crowd, she needed a main road. Instead, she found the back entrance of a high-end district, a service road that ended in a cul-de-sac of wet pavement and shadows. Her breath hitched in her throat, a ragged sob that she swallowed down. There was no outlet. The buildings rose up on either side like canyon walls, slick with rain and indifference, but the alley wasn't empty. It was dominated by a machine, a matte black sedan that looked more like a weapon than a car. The engine was idling, a low, throaty purr that vibrated in the puddles. Standing next to it, sheltered by the awning of a heavy steel door, was a man. He was smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing bright orange against the monochrome night. He didn't look like a delivery customer. He didn't look like a cop. He looked like a statue carved out of violence and expensive fabric. His suit was impeccable, untouched by the storm, and even from 20 feet away, Jimella could feel the gravity pulling around him. He was dangerous. Every instinct she had honed growing up in this city screamed it. Behind her, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. She didn't turn around, but she could feel the heat of the stalker's gaze on the back of her neck. He had cornered her. He wasn't rushing anymore because he knew he had nowhere else to go. Jimella looked at the man by the car. He hadn't noticed her yet, or if he had, he considered her beneath his notice. He was staring out into the rain, his expression bored, terrifyingly calm. She was trapped between two monsters. Behind her was a faceless predator who had hunted her for blocks, a known evil who intended to do her harm right now. In front of her was a man who looked like he owned the city, an unknown evil who might kill her just for interrupting his smoke break. The figure behind her took a step forward. Splash. Terror, sharp and cold, pierced through her exhaustion. The stalker was moving in. He was the certainty of pain. The man in the suit was just a possibility. Jimella made her choice. She didn't run away from the danger. She ran toward the one that looked like it had more power. She tightened her grip on the delivery bag, put her head down against the wind, and sprinted toward the man in the black suit, praying that a dragon might have mercy on a mouse if it asked nicely. Jimella didn't stop until she physically breached the invisible perimeter of wealth and violence that surrounded the man. She stumbled onto the dry concrete under the awning, her boots squeaking loudly in the heavy silence. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving, water dripping from the brim of her cap onto the pristine tips of his leather shoes. The man didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. He simply stopped the motion of his hand halfway to his mouth, the cigarette smoke curling lazily around his fingers. He looked down at her with an expression that wasn't angry, just deeply, terrifyingly attentive. "Please," she choked out, the word fracturing in her throat. She risked everything, stepping into his personal space, close enough to smell the sharp, expensive scent of oak moss and tobacco over the rot of the city rain. She leaned in, trembling so violently that the vibration traveled through the air between them, and whispered into the silk lapel of his suit. "He's following me." Jang Dong-soo lowered his hand slowly. He looked at the girl. He took in the details with the processing speed of a machine, the dilated pupils, the tear tracks cutting through the grime on her cheek, the knuckles white-knuckling the thermal bag. She was a rabbit that had run to the feet of a wolf to escape a wild dog. He shifted his gaze past her, out into the deluge. The hooded figure was there, standing just beyond the reach of the awning's light. The stalker hadn't run. He hadn't faded back into the shadows upon seeing a witness. He stood his ground, motionless in the downpour, staring back. That was the mistake. In Jang's world, fear was the currency and respect was the law. For a stranger to hunt on his doorstep was an intrusion, but to stand there and stare him down, that was an insult. The stalker wasn't just threatening the girl, he was disrespecting the territory. Jang dropped his cigarette. It hissed as it hit a stray puddle near his shoe. He didn't call for the guards inside the club. He didn't reach for the gun holstered beneath his arm. Instead, he stepped in. He raised his left arm, the heavy, tailored wool of his sleeve brushing against her soaked jacket, and wrapped it firmly around her shoulder. He pulled her into his side, a grip that was solid and heavy, less like an embrace and more like the locking mechanism of a vault door. He anchored her against him, physically claiming the space she occupied. Jimella froze, shocked by the sudden warmth and the weight of him. Jang didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the figure in the rain, his expression hardening into a look of lethal promise. She was no longer just a delivery girl. She was his. And now the problem was his, too. The rain formed a curtain between them, a shimmering gray veil that distorted the world beyond the awning. Under the shelter, the air was still. Jimella felt the man's ribcage expand against her shoulder as he took a slow, measured breath. He didn't tighten his grip, but the weight of his arm felt like an iron bar, locking her into place beside him. "She is with me," Jang said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the sound of the downpour with the flat, absolute authority of a judge passing a sentence. It wasn't a question and it wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, rewriting the reality of the situation. She was prey, now she is property. The figure in the rain didn't back down. He tilted his head, the motion jerky and avian under the heavy hood. A sound scratched its way out of his throat, a wet, rattling laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering on concrete. It was a sound of amusement, of derision. The stalker saw the suit, the polished shoes, the clean hands. He saw a soft target, a corporate suit trying to play knight in shining armor. "You think you can buy her?" the stalker rasped, his voice distorted by the distance and the wind. "She's not for sale, suit man. She's unfinished business." The stalker's hand moved from his pocket. It wasn't a blur of motion. It was slow, deliberate theater. The streetlights caught the edge of the blade first, a serrated hunting knife, ugly and rusted at the hilt. He flicked his wrist, and the blade caught the neon reflection of the club sign, painting a stripe of pink light across the steel. Jimella flinched, a whimper escaping her throat. She tried to step back to pull away from the coming violence, but Jang's arm didn't budge. He held her there, forcing her to witness. He didn't look at the knife. He looked at the man holding it with a profound, weary boredom. To the stalker, the knife was an ending. To Jang Dong-soo, it was just a tedious complication that was about to make him late. The stalker stepped forward, crossing the line from the rain into the dry circle of the entrance. He grinned, teeth yellow in the gloom, eyes fixed on the man in the suit. He didn't know he had just stepped into a cage with a tiger. He didn't see the tattoos climbing the neck until it was too late to run. The stalker lunged. It was a jagged, desperate thrust aimed at the solar plexus, the kind of move born in back alleys and fueled by adrenaline. To Jimella, it looked like a blur of motion that ended in death. To Jang Dong-soo, it looked like a frame-by-frame rehearsal of a mistake he had seen 1,000 times. Jang didn't step back, he stepped in. He released Jimella's shoulder, his hand sliding away with a surprising gentleness, only to transform instantly into a weapon. As the knife arc came down, Jang's left hand shot out, catching the stalker's wrist in a grip that stopped the momentum dead. There was no struggle for dominance, no wrestling. There was just a sharp, sickening crack, the sound of the radius bone snapping like a dry twig under the pressure of a hydraulic press. The stalker's scream was cut short. With his right hand, Jang drove an open palm upward into the man's chin. It was a precise, percussive strike that rattled the brain inside the skull and snapped the head back with whiplash force. The knife clattered to the wet concrete. The stalker's feet left the ground for a fraction of a second before he collapsed backward, landing in a heap of dirty laundry and broken intent. He tried to scramble up, but his body refused to obey. He just wheezed, clutching his shattered wrist, staring up with eyes that had gone from predatory to terrified. The entire exchange had taken 3 seconds. Jimella was pressed against the brick wall, her hands over her mouth, her breath trapped in her chest. She stared at the man on the ground, then at the man standing over him. Jang Dong-soo hadn't even broken his stance. He stood perfectly upright, the rain misting around him. He looked down at his suit jacket, brushed a microscopic speck of lint from his lapel, and adjusted his left cufflink. He wasn't winded. He wasn't angry. He looked like a man who had just swatted a mosquito. He turned to Jimella. The terrifying blankness in his eyes softened just a fraction as he looked at her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply offered her the reality of the situation. "He will not follow you anymore," Jang said calmly, stepping back under the awning to finish his cigarette. "Pick up your bag." The silence that followed the violence was fragile, broken only by the wheezing of the man on the ground and the relentless rhythm of the rain. Jimella was still pressed against the brickwork, her chest heaving, staring at the broken heap of a man who had been hunting her. She opened her mouth to speak, to thank the terrifying angel in the black suit, but a sound stopped her. A digital chirping, happy, melodic, and utterly out of place in the blood-streaked alley. It was coming from the stalker's pocket. The man on the ground groaned, instinctively trying to reach for his coat with a hand that was now shaped wrong. Jang stepped on the man's chest, not a stomp, but a heavy, pinning pressure that forced the air out of his lungs. He bent down, ignoring the mud splattering his cuffs, and fished a cracked smartphone out of the pocket. The screen lit up the gloom. No name, just a secure number. Jang looked at the phone, then at the man. A common street predator didn't use encrypted lines. A mugger didn't have a burner phone that cost more than Jimella's monthly rent. The realization hit Jang with the cold precision of a bullet. The girl hadn't been the target. She was the bait. He swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. He didn't speak. He just listened to the breathing on the other end. "Did he come out?" a voice asked. It was a rasping, deep voice, heavy with the accent of the Southern Busan syndicates. "Is the wolf awake?" Jang's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the alley seemed to drop 10 degrees. He knew that voice. Kang, the butcher of the southern district. "He is awake," Jang replied, his voice a low rumble. There was a pause on the line, a beat of silence where the power dynamic shifted violently. "Jang," Kang said, the amusement evident in his tone. "I told my scout you were getting soft, sitting in your high tower wearing your silk suits. I wanted to see if you still had teeth." "Your scout is broken," Jang said, staring down at the whimpering man. "And now I know where you are looking." "We're just testing the fences, Dong-soo, seeing where the cracks are. Keep the phone. Consider it a calling card." The line went dead. Jang lowered the device, his grip tightening until the screen cracked further under his thumb. This wasn't a random act of perversion. This was a probe. The rival syndicate was pushing into his territory, using chaos to test his response times, to see if the rumors of his retirement were true. They had used this girl's fear to draw him out, to see if the wolf would protect his flock or let them be eaten. He dropped the phone into a puddle. He turned back to Jimella. She was no longer just a civilian he had saved from a bad night. She was a witness to a declaration of war. She had seen his face, seen the violence, and was now standing in the center of a crosshair that was much, much bigger than she realized. "You cannot stay here," Jang said, walking toward her. The indifference was gone, replaced by a grim tactical calculation. "The rain is not the only thing falling tonight." Jang didn't ask her to follow him. He simply turned and walked toward the heavy steel service door, assuming the magnetic pull of his authority was enough. It was. Jimella, shivering and clutching her delivery bag like a lifeline, stepped over the legs of the groaning man and hurried after the wolf into the den. The transition was jarring. One moment she was drowning in the cacophony of rain and sirens. The next, the heavy door sealed behind them with a pressurized hiss, locking the world out. The silence inside was absolute, smelling of jasmine, old leather, and chilled air. They were in the back corridors of Club Nexus. Jang moved with the familiarity of a predator in its own cave, navigating the dimly lit hallway until they burst into the main VIP lounge. It was empty, the club closed for the night, leaving the space a cavern of velvet booths, crystal chandeliers, and polished obsidian floors. Jimella stopped at the edge of the carpet. She felt painfully, acutely aware of what she was, a dripping, muddy stain on a masterpiece. Her cheap sneakers squeaked against the marble. Water pooled around her feet, dark with street grime. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window, a terrified girl in an oversized jacket, standing next to a man who looked like he had been cut from a magazine page. "Sit," Jang said, pointing to a cream-colored leather armchair. "I'm wet," she whispered, her voice echoing too loudly in the empty room. "I'll ruin the leather." Jang walked to the bar, his back to her. "Furniture can be replaced, witnesses cannot." He poured a glass of water from a crystal pitcher and slid it across the polished counter toward her. He didn't pour one for himself. Instead, he took a white towel from a stack, wet it, and began to methodically wipe the blood from his knuckles. The red stained the white terracloth, blooming like a flower. Jimella sat on the edge of the chair, terrified to lean back. The luxury around her felt hostile, a different kind of danger than the alley. "Why am I here?" she asked, her hands shaking as she took the water. I need to finish my shift. If I don't deliver this, I get docked." Jang paused, the bloody towel suspended in his hand. He looked at her, really looked at her for the second time that night. He saw the universe she lived in, a world of docked pay, cold noodles, and fear. It was a universe away from his own, yet tonight they had collided. "Your shift is over," Jang said, his voice dropping an octave. He walked over to the window, looking out at the rain-lashed street where the shadows were beginning to move. "You walked into a war delivery, girl, and until the storm passes, this room is the only dry place in the city." The headlights of 3 black SUVs cut through the rain like searchlights, blinding white beams that swept across the front of Club Nexus. Tires screeched on the wet asphalt, a harsh, mechanical scream that shattered the quiet sanctuary of the lounge. Jang didn't flinch. He walked to the heavy glass doors, buttoning his jacket with a calm finality. "Lock this behind me," he said, not looking back at Jimella. "Do not open it for anyone but me." "You can't go out there," Jimella cried, gripping the armrest of the leather chair. "There's too many of them." "Calculated risk," Jang murmured. He stepped out into the storm, the heavy door sealing the girl inside the aquarium of silence. The street had become a staging ground. 12 men poured out of the vehicles, wielding bats, chains, and tire irons. They were Kang's heavy hitters, thugs who relied on numbers and noise. In the center of the formation, the rival lieutenant stepped forward, grinning through a mouthful of silver teeth. "Dong-soo," the lieutenant shouted over the thunder. "You hold onto our trash, we burn down your house. Simple math." Jang stood on the steps, the rain instantly soaking his suit again. He looked at the mob, then glanced back at the tinted glass where he knew Jimella was watching. "The math is wrong," Jang said. "You have 12 men. You need 50. The lieutenant roared, and the mob surged forward. It wasn't a fight. It was a demolition. Jang moved into the chaos not with the frantic energy of a brawler, but with the precision of a piston. The first attacker swung a lead pipe. Jang stepped inside the arc, catching the man's throat with a ridge hand strike that collapsed his windpipe. The man fell, gasping, and Jang used his body as a shield against the next swing. The violence was wet and brutal. The sound of fists meeting flesh cracked like thunderclaps. Jang was a blur of black silk and kinetic energy. He broke an arm to disarm a knife wielder, then used the knife to pin a third man's jacket to the tire of an SUV. One of the thugs tried to bypass the melee, sprinting toward the club entrance. His eyes locked on the silhouette of the girl behind the glass. Jang saw him. The cold detachment vanished, replaced by a flash of protective rage. He abandoned his defensive stance, sprinting across the slick pavement. He tackled the runner just as his hand reached the door handle, slamming him into the brick facade with enough force to shake the building. Jang grabbed the man by the collar and hurled him back into the rain, away from Jimella, away from the sanctuary. He stood before the door, chest heaving, blood mixing with the rainwater on his face. He wasn't fighting for territory anymore. He was the gatekeeper, and the girl inside was the only thing that mattered. "Next," Jang snarled, raising his fists. The last engine roared away into the night, carrying the broken remnants of Kang's crew. The street was left in a heavy, bruised silence, punctuated only by the groans of the men left behind on the pavement and the relentless drumming of the rain. Jang Dong-soo stood amidst the wreckage of the brawl. His suit jacket was torn at the shoulder, his white shirt stained with mud and blood that wasn't his. He rolled his neck, a sickening crack that echoed in the quiet, and exhaled a plume of mist into the cold air. He didn't check for injuries, he checked his watch. The heavy glass door of the club clicked open. Jimella stepped out, her face pale, eyes wide as she took in the devastation. She looked at the bodies scattered like discarded trash, then at the man standing in the center of it all. He looked like a ruin, terrifying and magnificent. She walked down the steps, her shoes splashing in pink-tinged puddles. She stopped a few feet from him, unsure of the protocol for speaking to a warlord who had just dismantled a dozen men for her. "You're bleeding," she whispered. Jang wiped a streak of red from his jaw with his thumb. "It's not mine." He looked down at her hands. She was still clutching the thermal bag, her knuckles white. "The noodles," he said, nodding at the bag. "They are cold." Jimella blinked, the adrenaline crash making her dizzy. "What?" "You said you get docked if you don't deliver," Jang stated simply. He walked past her toward the matte black sedan that had remained miraculously untouched under the awning. He opened the passenger door and looked back at her. "Get in." I can't pay you," she stammered. "I don't have money for a ride like this." "I am not a taxi," Jang said, his voice flat. "And I am not offering you money. I am offering you a completion of contract. Get in." The drive was silent. The city blurred past the tinted windows, neon signs smearing into lines of light. They pulled up to a crumbling apartment complex 3 blocks away. The customer was waiting outside, looking irate under an umbrella. Jang watched from the driver's seat as Jimella stepped out into the rain. She handed over the bag. The customer started to yell, pointing at his watch. Jang didn't move, didn't roll down the window. He just turned his head slowly, locking eyes with the customer through the rain-streaked glass. The man froze. The shouting died in his throat. He hurriedly shoved a tip into Jimella's hand, grabbed the food, and retreated inside. Jimella stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the cash damp in her palm. She looked back at the car. The window rolled down an inch. "Go home, Jimella," Jang said. It was the first time he had used her name. She nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through the exhaustion. She turned and walked down the street toward the subway station. She didn't hunch her shoulders. She didn't check her reflection in the store windows. She didn't look back. For the first time in years, the street didn't feel like a hunting ground. The darkness stretched out behind her, deep and impenetrable, but she no longer feared what was hiding in it. The monster wasn't chasing her anymore. He was watching her back. The shadow was still there, but now it belonged to a guardian.